Well, first of all, I just want to thank you all for coming. It's a treat to have you here. A number of you have been very important. I've just finished a documentary for MSNBC called The People versus the Politicians, which is going to be my topic today in one form or another. Here we are, one happy family, island feeling full of conviviality. Wonderful summer afternoon, early fall afternoon, sunny, pleasant life, pleasant island, pleasant country. No, wait a minute. This is a toxic time in America. It's a time when we're literally exploding almost daily in this country. Anger is so prevalent, so all-present, so omnipresent, that down in Georgia, there's a woman who refuses to wash the dishes when her husband puts his pro-Trump mug in the sink. Up in New Hampshire, there's a woman who's hired a psychiatrist to see if she can get her daughters to speak to each other. They haven't spoken since the 2016 election. One's pro-Trump, one's anti-Trump. You literally have ministers and rabbis across the country saying that people in their congregations are at each other's throats. Fortune 500 companies are actually reporting a decline in productivity because work teams can't work well together because of political disagreements in the workplace. And you probably have 80% of the people, I saw one poll recently said 80% of the people in this country think that public debate has gotten so acrimonious, so mean, that it is literally dangerous for the country. Now, of course, Donald Trump is at the center of this. And actually, that's really kind of where he likes to be, at the center of this kind of an argument. But if you stop and think about it for a moment, Trump is actually not the origin of our current national dyspepsia. He's a symptom more than a cause. He's an aggravation. He's making it worse. His divisive politics, his condemnation of his foes, his insults add to the national distemper over politics. But he didn't start it. Think about it for a moment. Just go back. Do you remember before Donald Trump was elected, we used to have government shutdowns periodically? That all happened pre-Trump. Do you remember the guy named John Boehner who was Speaker of the House of Representatives? He could not control his own caucus in the House of Representatives because of rebellion within the ranks. Paul Ryan is quitting as Speaker, and he hasn't said so publicly yet. But the basic reason most smart political analysts think is that he can't control the caucus either. There's a group in the caucus called the Freedom Caucus. 40, 45 people, extreme right, who can block almost any piece of legislation in the House. And when you stop and think about the last several years of American politics, we as a nation, as a government, have not been able to solve any major problem. Education, immigration, gun safety, environment, you name it, jobs. The problems roll on and on and on. We've got a dysfunctional government. And what I would suggest is today, instead of doing what most of my colleagues in the media are doing, which is to focus just on this election and just on the political parties and just on Washington, is that we expand our focus and we think not about the state of the union, but the state of our democracy. Is our democracy working? Are we being heard? Are we being listened to? Do our votes count? Is there a level playing field in our politics so that when we do vote, politicians are motivated to listen to us and to respond to us? Or is something wrong? Well, the public verdict is pretty clear. Poll after poll after poll, not just in the last 2 or 3 years, but the last 15 or 20 years. I can go way back. People are saying, 80% or so of people are saying, Washington doesn't listen to people like us. Lobbyists have too much power. Special interests have too much power. Corporations have captured the government. Elections are rigged. 90% in one poll said American democracy is broken. That's the public verdict. And part of the problem is that this kind of negative assessment not only inflames people, makes them angry, makes them frustrated, causes us to fight with each other because we can't see Washington or our government getting anywhere. It makes us feel powerless. We feel powerless as a people. And a friend of mine in the Southwest, a guy named Ernie Cortez, a very wise Latino organizer, said, power corrupts, Rick, but powerlessness also corrupts democracy at the core. If we believe we are powerless to fix things, if we believe we're powerless to stop elections from being rigged, if we believe we're powerless to stop the restoration of the political middle, which is absolutely vital to the functioning of our democracy, then in fact we are powerless. We have to believe in our own power in order to exercise it. Now I'm going to pull a switch on you today from most of the media, and I'm going to tell you people power is on the move. People power is actually getting something done. People power is actually changing things in America. And the tragedy is, I'm sorry to say, that most of the mainstream media is not covering that story except as a daily blip here or there. To learn more about the victories of citizen reform movements, come to our website, reclaimtheamericandream.org, and click on Success Stories, and check out our YouTube channel, The People versus the Politicians. Let's just take the fundamental issue of money in politics. Money in politics. We're upset about it. We can see the billionaires and the corporations spending enormous amounts of money. We're frustrated. We think that our votes don't count because somebody else has got a louder microphone and a larger megaphone. Not a new issue. Not a new issue. If I had to pick the Paul Revere for reforming money in politics, it would be Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt. So we're going back 115 years to Teddy Roosevelt. Not a new problem. Railroad barons, John D. Rockefeller the first, not the later ones, John D. Rockefeller the first, Wall Street, Tammany Hall. Those names all ring with financial corruption, don't they? I don't want to misquote Teddy Roosevelt. I brought one quote from him along, so I want to read it to you because it's so rich and it's so pregnant for today. And what's amazing is how long ago he said it. This is Teddy Roosevelt in 1904. There is no enemy of free government more dangerous and none so insidious as the corruption of the electorate. The answer, he said, were laws against bribery and the corruption in federal elections. In the election in 1912, William Howard Taft turned down a $50,000 campaign contribution. $50,000 then would be $1 million today. Why did he turn it down? Because he believed it would make it look as though he had been politically bought. Isn't that interesting? That back in that period, we had Republican presidential candidates refusing to take a campaign contribution of that size. Look how much our politics have changed. Okay? In 1907, 111 years ago, Congress passed the first piece of legislation that outlawed corporate contributions to political campaigns. It stood for over a century until the Citizen United decision of 2010. And then when you come forward in the 1970s, you have another burst of political reform trying to control money, because back during the Watergate crisis and the Watergate scandal, there were literally bags of cash being passed around on the floor of Congress. Okay? I did a video once and I had John Boehner admit to me on camera that he had actually made a cash payment on the floor of the House of Representatives. Okay? So in 1970, you have another burst of reform. And then in 2000, you have another burst of reform. And who do you have at the front of it? The gentleman who died just the other day, John McCain. Think of it. Now, we tend to think of it. The Democrats are for campaign reform and the Republicans are against it. I've just given you Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and John McCain. So American history suggests something else. American history suggests that there are people in both parties who are worried about the pernicious effect of big money in politics. Not the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, all we need to do is publicize it. Let people know. The Citizens United decision said corporations, anybody can contribute unlimited amounts to campaigns. But public disclosure will be the cleansing fluid, will be the protection, will keep our system healthy. And Justice John Paul Stevens warned in his dissent, this will open the floodgates of big money into American politics. The year before the Citizens United decision, the total amount of money being spent by super PACs in 2009 was $9 million. In the year of 2010, when that decision was made, it jumped to $300 million. And in the last election, it was $1.4 billion. So Stevens was right. But what's interesting is, immediately, we get a kind of Newtonian reaction. You remember that old physics principle? A given action spawns and creates an opposite, equal and opposite reaction. Within 3 months, the state of Hawaii the legislature passed a resolution saying Citizens United was against the Constitution. We need to roll it back. Corporations are not people. Money is not speech. Congress needs to have the constitutional amendment to have Congress have the power to regulate campaign finance. Since that time, 19 states have gone on record calling for a constitutional amendment to roll back Citizens United. One of them is Washington State, and I'll get to that in a moment. What's interesting, though, is there are over 800 different cities and communities around the country that have done the same thing. And I'm not just talking about those big liberal central eastern seaboard cities like New York or San Francisco, that crazy liberal city. No, I'm talking about Midway, Kentucky, and Conway City, Arkansas, and San Luis Obispo, California, and Sarasota, Florida. It's all over the place. People are on fire. People are upset that we could have this kind of an explosion of campaign spending, which is corrupting our democracy, and they're reacting. 19 states, about 800 cities and local governments. I went and covered the story, and it's in the documentary that I've made in Washington State. You all voted on it. I-735, do you remember that? Just 2 years ago in 2016. And the woman who ran that campaign is fascinating. Her name is Cindy Black. You've never heard of her. She's not a big name. She's not a big politician. In fact, when I went to Cindy, I said, Cindy, what's your background for running this campaign? She said, well, I was a volunteer 3 or 4 years ago. We tried it. We didn't make it. And we're trying again now. And I sort of worked my way up the ranks. Cindy Black, when she finished high school, went into the Air Force. She was a technician. She repaired tanker planes. She was a crew chief. This gal was a crew chief. She gets out of the Air Force, and she goes to college, and she becomes a family counselor. And she counsels people for quite a while, for about 20 years or so. And then she decides to go into business for herself, and she runs a small business. That's her qualifications. I talked to Kevin Ranker, our state senator, about running a statewide campaign in Washington State. He said to do that, to win on a ballot initiative, you need at least $3 million. I guarantee you I-735 had less than $500,000. So I said to Cindy Black, how do you do it? You don't have money? You don't have a political organization? You don't have a party behind you? You don't have big funders? She said, we talk to people. We talk to people face to face. That's how we do it. And you know what happened? 63% of the people in this state voted against Citizens United. And that's happened in one state after another. In Colorado, it happened, and they got about 74% of the vote. What's really interesting is, and this is to get rid of some of the cloud that we have hanging over American politics, that some of this stuff is really partisan. It's one party against the other, and we can't get past anything. In Colorado, every single county in the state voted around 70 to 75% in favor of revoking Citizens United. All the blue counties, all the purple counties, and all the red counties. It's not a partisan issue. It's a partisan issue in Washington. It's a partisan issue among office holders, but it's not a partisan issue out here in the country. And that tells us something. That tells us that people like Cindy Black can go out and do something and begin to turn politics around. Now, that's money. Let's talk about the next big bugaboo that's really busting our government in Washington. Gerrymandering. Gerrymandering, okay? And if you know American politics, you say, oh, well, Smith, don't tell us this story. This is an old story. Gerrymandering's been going on in America since 1812 when Eldridge Gerry, not Jerry, but Gerry, then Democratic governor of Massachusetts, said, you know, if we can switch the lines in the districts right around Boston here, we can control the legislature and keep our party in power. And lo and behold, it worked. It worked so well, it started to spread to other states. Democrats do it in some states, Republicans do it in other states, and until 2010, it was done state by state. Now, what happened in 2010 was a revolution in gerrymandering. There was a program called Red Map, Republican Redistricting Mapping Program. It was a brilliant concept, run by Karl Rove, who was an advisor to George W. Bush, ran his presidential campaigns, and a bunch of other very smart and canny Republican political strategists. And what they said was, this is 2010. This election coming up is 2010. We're going to have a census, and in 2011, the state governments are going to reapportion the seats in Congress and in their own state legislatures. So we want to get control of as many legislatures as we can. Now listen to how smart this was. There's something like 5,000 legislative seats all over the country. And what they did was they studied the different states and they figured out if they could switch 116 seats, 116 seats out of 5,000 in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana and Florida and so forth, we can flip the control of either the House or the Senate or both in that state, and therefore we can run the redistricting process in 2011. And guess what? They picked up 675 legislative seats nationwide, and they flipped, I don't know if this number means anything to you, but to me it blows my mind. They flipped 17 legislative chambers, which meant the Republican Party had control of both the House and the Senate and the governor's chair in 2011 in 31 states, which meant they drew the maps. Well, you say, drawing maps, sounds nice. Smith, come on, get practical. Well, if you go to the 2012 election, what's really interesting is that you find that in the nationwide popular vote, and this is going to matter, by the way, for 2018, so these numbers are important. If you go to the nationwide popular vote, Democratic candidates for the House of Representatives actually won 1.5 million more votes than Republicans did. But Republicans wound up with a 33-seat majority in the House. If you look at a state like Ohio, which is pretty even, I mean, year after year, Ohio has voted for the winner in the presidential election in the last 14 elections in a row. They don't care whether it's a Democrat or Republican, they vote for the winner. They know how to pick them. So they're flipping back and forth at the national level. So you would figure in the House, 16 seats, 8-8, 9-7, 12-4, Republican. Pennsylvania, pretty similar thing. It went by 65,000, 70,000 votes for Trump in 2016. Same thing, should be pretty even. 18 seats, 13-5 Republican. North Carolina, same thing, 10-3. Michigan, 11-5. Florida, 27-17. State after state after state. If you take a very close look at the way the maps are drawn, people who have studied this say that the gerrymandering nationwide that was achieved by the Republican Party, and I tip my hat to them. I mean, they were smart enough to do this. They executed it. They carried it out, and it's paid off in their control of the House of Representatives for this entire decade. They get an advantage of 16 to 22 seats. The estimates vary, but at least 16 to 22. What that means is if you're looking at 2018, and you are either cheering for or afraid of a blue wave, just understand that the Democrats have to win the popular vote by 3 or 4 million just to break even. Okay? You don't hear many people talking to you about that when you're reading about whether or not there's going to be a blue wave. So this is a very fundamental issue, the tilting. And the reason why the tilting is so important, I'm going to go back to John Boehner and Paul Ryan, is that the 40 or 45 backbench Republicans in the House of Representatives who are basically blocking their own leadership. This is not just blocking Trump. This is not just blocking Obama. This is blocking their own leadership. from moving legislation to the House, 43 of those 45 representatives come from gerrymandered districts, where the turnout in the Republican primary ranges from 3% to 12% of the electorate. I'm glad somebody laughed. I mean, when you think of American democracy, and you think, you know, if you look at national opinion polls, and the polls tell you something about what people feel about gun safety or gun control or about immigration, and you say, why doesn't Congress respond? One reason it doesn't respond is because there are 43 people sitting in the House of Representatives who are insulated from that public opinion because they know in their district the opinion is A, different, and B, the turnout's tiny. And a little bit of money goes a long ways in those districts. So if you're thinking with me, you're understanding that we got to fix gerrymandering if we want that system to work in Washington. We don't have a shot at it if it doesn't get fixed. Now, the unbelievable happy news is, you won't believe this, 27 of our 50 states are at work on fixing gerrymandering. Let me repeat that. 27 out of our 50 states. I got a map on my website, reclaimtheamericandream.org. You won't believe it. 11 states have already, and Washington is one of them, we can talk about that in a minute. 11 states have already moved to a system of independent bipartisan commissions. They've taken the job out of the hands of the legislature. The latest was Ohio. In May, the voters in Ohio just approved a gerrymander reform that will affect the next census. There are 4 states this year that have that on the ballot. I bet you couldn't name those 4 states. I bet this entire group couldn't name the 4 states because they're not California, and they're not Massachusetts, and they're not New York, and they're not Connecticut. They're not all the liberal states. They're Michigan, Colorado, Missouri, and catch this, Utah. Now, Jimmy, stop and think about this. Stop and think about what I've just told you. You can't imagine that already 11 states have voted in some kind of reform, and you've got 4 more states working on it, and 8 other states have filed lawsuits against it in Alabama and Virginia and North Carolina and Texas and on, and Maryland and so forth. Okay? So we are at work on this. People are doing something about this. We need to come back to Washington. I hope somebody asks me about Washington. Washington has a bipartisan commission, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and a neutral chairman. Great idea, except for one thing. The chairman has no vote. Big problem. What that means is the parties bargain. We'll give you those safe districts, you take those safe districts. The point of gerrymander reform is not to reward one party or the other. The point of gerrymander reform is to make so many districts competitive that voters' votes count. If the 2 parties agree to stack the deck, you know, up here in the islands and then over on the eastern part of the state, you don't get much choice, particularly if you disagree with who's in. And on the other side, what you want is competitive. The whole idea of democracy is to be competitive. The whole idea is a marketplace of ideas. So gerrymander reform that's working towards that is important. In the last 3 years, the Supreme Court has made a bunch of decisions on gerrymandering. All the bad ones get remembered, but the good one was 3 years ago, the Arizona legislature said the people of Arizona don't have the right to pass a gerrymander reform in Arizona. The Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, they said, gives us the right. We're the ones who can control it. It literally says the time and manner of elections shall be determined by the state legislature. So the legislature sued the independent redistricting commission in Arizona and said, you have no constitutional right. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that when the voters of Arizona voted to vote in an independent commission, they were exercising the legislative power of the state. They were acting. The power of the people is fundamental. So the Supreme Court affirmed the power of the people, which turned the green light open to all these other movements that I'm describing to you now. In Florida, in 2010, remember now, 2010 was the Tea Party year. 2010 was the year in which you would imagine no reform was possible. In Florida, for the 5th time, they tried gerrymander reform, and they put the vote before the people. In that election, Oh, and they had wonderful ads. Had wonderful ads. They said in the ads, "We don't let foxes guard the hen house. We don't let bank robbers guard the bank. Why do we let politicians draw the lines for districts?" Great ad. Great ad. It worked really well. So that's my foxes ad. I love that. Anyway, they put this on the ballot. The Republicans swept the election for the state house, for the state senate, and the governor's seat. And in Florida, if you want to amend the Constitution, and it took a constitutional amendment to pass gerrymander reform, you had to get a 60% majority, supermajority. It passed by 62.9%. So it got voted in. And the legislature immediately surrendered, and the leaders said, "Okay, we'll abide by it. We'll run the cleanest redistricting in the history of the state of Florida." It sounded too good to be true. And actually it was. It was not true. What was going on was they went through a very big charade, and they actually arranged a secret cabal with Republican strategists outside the legislature who drew maps and then passed them through public hearings to the state legislature. And it was the same old gerrymandering. The League of Women Voters, Common Cause, Fair Districts Florida went to court. It took 3 years. Florida Supreme Court in July 2015 ruled 5-2. This is an unconstitutional gerrymander. There's absolutely no question this was a game being played. This is the court talking this way. Game being played by the politicians with their political strategists. And the court ordered 8 of the congressional districts in Florida remapped, and every single district in the state senate remapped. We began to see the results in the 2016 elections. 5 incumbents were ousted. More heads are going to roll this year. It's amazing what they did in Florida. And the standard was very simple. For the first time in the history of America, a state said it is unconstitutional to draw district lines that favor one party over the other. Just plain, simple English language. No other state has yet adopted something that simple. Some of them have approached it, but none has been that simple. It's a standard out there for other people to copy. But my point is that's happening. You got these 4 states this year. You've got 11 states already on board. You got a state like Florida and you can begin to see that there's a change in these delegations. In Pennsylvania, people filed a suit, and the state Supreme Court said that the maps that were drawn by the Republican legislature in 2011. Now, it looks like I'm blaming the Republicans. I'm not. The Republicans are just in control of many more state governments than the Democrats. The Democrats do it in Maryland. The Democrats do it in Illinois. The Democrats do it in Massachusetts. And there's a lawsuit by Republican voters in Maryland against the legislature. And by the way, the Republican governor of Maryland, a guy named Larry Hogan, is pushing for gerrymander reform in Maryland. So this is not a partisan issue. It's just an issue that's come up when the Republicans were a heck of a lot more clever about it than the Democrats have been. So that's a second issue. Third issue, voting rights. Absolutely fundamental. Absolutely fundamental. Who can vote? Who gets a chance to go in and cast a ballot? Now, the big question is whether or not people take advantage of that and exercise their right. We're missing about 41 million voters that are eligible that aren't even registered in this country. So it's huge. But in 2013, the Supreme Court issued a ruling which knocked down parts of the Voting Act of 1965. And right after that, 16 states passed very restrictive voter ID laws, that you had to have a photo ID. Photo ID sounds pretty normal. Sounds pretty natural to most of us. If you got a driver's license, you got a photo ID. What's the big deal, right? Well, we live in the part of the economy where it's just taken for granted that you have photo ID. But there are lots of people who don't. And there are lots of people for whom getting photo ID is difficult. In our film, we actually show a woman named Rosanelle Eaton. There's a wonderful moment. She's standing at a rally in North Carolina, 92 years old. Rosanelle Eaton, when she was about 25, back in the old days of Jim Crow, they made her recite verbatim the preamble to the U.S. Constitution in order to qualify to vote. She did it, word for word. She qualified. So she's a pretty smart woman, and she's been involved in lots of other things. When North Carolina passed its photo ID law, she and 300,000 other people in North Carolina, mostly blacks, were disenfranchised. They didn't have the right kind of qualification. So she then starts to go around to try to get the right kind of qualification. That she's got a very peculiar name, Rosanelle Eaton. Rosanelle is actually one word. She didn't have a birth certificate because she was born at home. So she needs a birth certificate in order to get a state ID. So she can't get that. So then she's got to fiddle around for several weeks just to try to get a document in place of a birth certificate. And then when she finally gets it, it doesn't have the same spelling of her name as in the state records, the state voting records. And so she has to spend some more weeks to try to straighten out the misspellings. And it's a fairly common phenomenon. And that's going on. And you can imagine the toughest voter ID laws are in places like Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, but also Indiana, Kansas, Texas, North Dakota. In North Dakota, it's Indians, Native Americans. Interesting issue. The law in North Dakota to qualify for a state ID to vote requires a street address. Now, I didn't know this. On most reservations, you have a P.O. box. You don't have a street address. And so this made it impossible for the Native Americans in North Dakota, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, to get voter ID. So there had to be a lawsuit filed, and finally a federal judge ruled that that was an unconstitutional limitation because it was prejudice against a particular class of people whose basic way of life did not generate the kind of document that the law was requiring. So these things are going on all the time. And these are being fought. And a few of these have been knocked down and changed. In North Carolina, it went into court, and it's very interesting. In North Carolina, it wasn't just a photo ID law. But what they did is they reduced the number of days of early voting. Early voting is very important, okay? And it's particularly important, think of it, in African American communities where people go to church on Sunday morning and they do what's called souls to the polls. They go to church, and then they bus people from the church to the voting precinct. All right? There's nothing illegal about that. It's just convenient. It's a means of transportation and so forth. What they did was they knocked out voting on the Sunday before the Tuesday that was election day, which was pretty painful for a lot of people who wanted to do it. And they knocked out same-day registration, which is another convenience for people who live in rural areas to be able to come in and vote on the same day that you register. Okay? So it's been in battle. And what happened was that went into court, and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that this was an unconstitutional law. It was discriminatory against blacks, which the court said were almost targeted with almost surgical precision. In other words, they went back and they looked at the kinds of things that African American voters in North Carolina were using in the election system, and those were the things that got cut back in this law. It's still going on. The fight in North Carolina is still going on even in this election. But the courts have ruled in its favor. Now, that's one group of states. Now, there's another group of states that are going exactly the opposite direction. They're making voting easier. There was a motor voter law passed in Congress back in the 1990s. And what that said was when you renew your driver's license, your registration is automatically renewed. It's very important because, stop and think about it, lots of driver's licenses need to be renewed when people move. Most people, when they move in America, don't realize they have to re-register to vote. My wife and I, Susan and I, moved from Maryland to the District of Columbia. We went and got ourselves new driver's licenses, and we registered in the District of Columbia. We didn't bother to go back to tell the state of Maryland we were no longer there. But if you're in Maryland and you move from, I don't know, Montgomery Avenue to Main Street, you think, I'm still in Maryland. I don't need to re-register. Well, in fact, you do. In most states, you have to re-register. It's possible if you only move a few blocks away, you're still in the same precinct. But most of the time, you do. So this automatic motor voter registration is a big step forward. Some states have gone beyond motor voter. What they say is if you interact with any state agency, health department, welfare department, whatever agency you interact with, if you interact with them and they need to deal with you, your voter registration is automatically renewed. That's going on in Oregon and California and so forth. So that's a very, very smart idea. Then the other thing is what I mentioned before, same-day registration. There are a dozen states that now have motor voter registration. There are now 17 states that have same-day registration. And Washington State is way out front. Washington State now has mail-in ballots, And not only that, Washington State, the state pays the postage. Now, not a big deal, but what that really means is not the 48 cents. What that means is you fill out the ballot, you stick it in the post box, and it's done. The whole point is to make it easier. So we've got two different trends going on there. Now, there's one other place I want to applaud Washington State before I get to one little needle. One of the things that we need to do in this country, and it's very difficult to figure out how to do this, is to restore the political middle. There's no way this government of ours can work in Washington if you've got people who come from gerrymandered districts for Republicans at one end and gerrymandered districts for Democrats at the other end, and nobody in midfield. You cannot pass legislation with people at the goalposts on both ends, right? So how do you restore the middle? This state had a wonderful idea. Back in 2004, you all, citizens of this state, voted in the nonpartisan primary, the top two primary. Everybody runs, everybody votes in the same primary. What's the point? The point is that if everybody votes in the same primary, politicians have to appeal across party lines. It begins to tug people towards the center. Being an extremist candidate in that kind of environment is not very smart. It doesn't work. The second thing is it lets independents vote. Independents are now more numerous than Democrats and than Republicans in almost every state in the union, and certainly nationwide. There are about 40% of the electorate is independent nationwide, and about 30% in each of the two parties. And in the younger generation, 35 and under, 50% plus are now independents. So if you have a nonpartisan primary, you're letting them in on the first big vote. The other thing that happens is you actually begin to see a change in who wins. And it's going on in this state right now. You have in the 4th Congressional District over in the eastern part of the state, near Yakima, going north, rural ranching area, a guy named Dan Newhouse. Dan Newhouse was a moderate mainstream Republican who actually served in the cabinet of Christine Gregoire, Democratic governor. So this is a Republican who's willing to serve in a Democratic administration. So he's willing to work across party lines. When he ran initially under the old system, he kept coming in second in the Republican primary to a guy out there who's a real Tea Party guy before the Tea Party was ever founded, okay? So he couldn't ever get there. But as soon as you got to the top two primary, he ran second in the primary. And then when you had everybody voting in the general election and all the other candidates eliminated, he kept winning in the general election. And the same thing happened in Seattle. The Whatcom County and Skagit County and Snohomish County and part of King County are part of the 1st district. There's a woman there named Susan Delbeni, a former Microsoft executive, and she's sort of middle of the road, and she keeps winning there. What's fascinating and what you need to take home is that if you look at the voting records in Congress of all 10 members of the Washington State delegation, not a single one of them is in the outer 25% of either party. All 10 members of this state's delegation are playing in the middle of the field. If we could have 10 other states adopt that idea, we would have a workable Congress. If you could have, you know, the likes of Massachusetts and Illinois and Ohio and Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Texas adopt that, it would be a different ball game there. So you're way ahead there. But there's one place that you could do something in this state. We're a bit behind. And that's public funding of campaigns. The big question is, what do you do about the power of mega money? What do you do about the billionaire and corporate money that's buying up elections and buying up influence? And by the way, in the super PAC spending, I mentioned to you $1.4 billion in the last election in super PAC spending. 70% of that money came from 100 donors. 100 donors contributed $1 billion of that $1.4 billion. So it's lopsided way at the top, okay? So how do you answer that? Well, there are different ways. With the Supreme Court rulings, it's very hard to put a limit on contributions. But the way some states have done it is with public funding of campaigns. People forget, we had public funding of presidential campaigns through 6 elections. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Bill Clinton all used public funding in their campaigns, and so did their opponents in the primary election and in the general election. And in return for public funding, they agreed to limits on spending in their campaigns. That broke down with George Bush and with Barack Obama. The main thing was campaigns got so expensive, and people stopped doing that little checkoff. I don't know if you remember it. On the tax return, there was a checkoff. You could say, I'm willing to contribute $1, $3, $5, whatever. And that was what was funding, public funding of campaigns. But as the federal funding faded out, state funding came in. There are now 21 states that have some form of public funding of campaigns. Most of them have it for judicial elections. A few of them had it just for the governor. As a matter of fact, I mentioned before, Larry Hogan, the Republican governor of Maryland, is a publicly funded candidate. He ran against a Democratic machine in a Democratic state, couldn't raise anywhere near as much money, and he got elected with public funding. So he's a big believer in public funding. What's interesting is there are 4 or 5 states that have really strong systems: Arizona, Minnesota, Maine, and Connecticut. I went up to Connecticut. It is utterly amazing what happens in this politics of a state when you get public funding of local campaigns. And by local, I mean governor and state legislature. I don't mean congressman and senator, okay? Connecticut started this in 2008, the same year that Washington State started nonpartisan primary elections. And it's worked for the last 5 elections. The participation is voluntary, has to be. Supreme Court rulings require that. Every single candidate for statewide office, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, state treasurer, whatever it is, both Republicans and Democrats took public funding in the last election. 80% of the candidates from both parties took public funding for the state legislature. So it's highly adopted, highly accepted. And what happens is, who can run changes. The face of the legislature changes. Suddenly middle-class people can run. It used to cost $200,000 or so to run for a state Senate seat. Now you have to raise on your own. To prove you're a viable candidate, to qualify for public funding, you have to raise $15,000. But from then on, you get $95,000 from the state, and that's the same as your opponent gets. And suddenly you've got people from inner cities. You got white workers who couldn't have thought about it before. You've got school teachers who can now run. There are now 3 times as many blacks and Latinos in the Connecticut state legislature as there were 10 years ago. There are twice as many women as there were 10 years ago. And what happens then is the agenda changes. The power of lobbyists changes. Lobbyists still have influence, but they have to have the influence through the strength of their arguments. It's not the checkbook in their vest pocket that decides it. If you remember Sandy Hook, there were only 2 states in the Union after the slaughter of the kids in Sandy Hook, after that gun violence, that passed significant gun laws, and one of them was Connecticut. Now the NRA and the gun lobbies were active in Connecticut, but they couldn't influence the vote in the same way that they could have years before. And there's all kinds of other stuff. There's child care, there's job support, there's health care measures that are being taken care of in Connecticut that simply weren't on the agenda before. Think of it for a moment. You live in a state that has been in a turmoil for I don't know how many years, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, over the funding of schools, in the school system. The courts ruled that there was an unconstitutional system. If you have public funding of campaigns in this state, and if you had real good gerrymander reform on the state legislature, do you think you'd have the kind of deadlock you have today? I don't live here all the time, but my hunch is the answer is no. The point I'm trying to make to you, and maybe this is a bit too much serious detail, but I'm trying to tell you in very concrete terms, reform is possible. We can fix our democracy. People are fixing our democracy. It is happening in many states. I said to you, 28 are dealing with gerrymander reform. 21 have public funding of campaigns. 19 have voted to roll back Citizens United. In some cases, there's overlap, but lots of them are different. Things are happening. I talked to Ellen Frieden, who ran the gerrymander reform campaign in Florida, one of the most unbelievable grassroots organizers and advocates of reform I've ever met. And I said, what's the message of Florida to the rest of the country? She said, I say to people who complain about American democracy, get out there and fix it. And the guy who worked with her in the Latino community was named Jorge Marzulli. And his answer is, if we can do it in Florida, you can do it in your state. Thanks very much. And if anybody has a question, well, particularly up front, if you have a question up front, I can hand you a mic.
Rick, I think you mentioned earlier that there's a caucus in D.C. that's made up of people on both sides of the aisle that's trying to create some new movement. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, what Bill Clapp is referring to, he and I were talking before I stood up and you all came in. There are all kinds of efforts going on in this country to try to bridge this terrible, hyper-partisan Grand Canyon that we have in this country. We really have to get beyond it. We have to be inventive. And there's a group called No Labels, which was founded about 15, 20 years ago by Republicans and Democrats who wanted to get past party labels and try to work together without being caught up in that, and even try to put together a ticket that would be Republican for number one and Democrat for number two, or vice versa, whatever. They didn't succeed in that, but what they have succeeded in doing is they've begun recruiting members of the House of Representatives in what they call the Problem Solvers Caucus. And the Problem Solvers Caucus members commit themselves to try to find bipartisan solutions to one issue after another: immigration reform, labor laws, gun safety, whatever the issue is, women's rights, whatever. And what's interesting is they've been able to recruit 38 members, 19 Democrats and 19 Republicans. And their rule is they will not take any additional members from one party unless that person can bring in somebody from the other party along with them. And this just started in the last couple of years. And I got to tell you, 38 doesn't sound like much out of 435, and it's not. But 38 in the kind of atmosphere that we've been living through is, I think, one more measure that people are fed up with this situation and they're determined to do something. And fed up is something we can all talk about at dinner, but doing something is what we need to talk about the next morning. And that's what I'm trying to inculcate here, is this hope and this spirit and this can-do notion that people can make a difference and make a change.
Are they listed somewhere if somebody wanted to know who they were?
They are. If you go, I think you can go, I'm not certain if this is right, but I think you can go to the Problem Solvers Caucus on the internet and you can find out who they are. Yep.
Discussion has been largely focused on election reform and the gerrymandering and all those kind of issues, and recapturing democracy in that sense. I think that over the years, and I would be talking about around 50 years, is the erosion on the economic equity in the country and the imbalance, one might say, between capital and labor, that when democracy functions best is when there's closer equity in that realm. So do you see this change you're talking about bringing about the change that's been so fundamental that to me caused the anger in the voters to do some of the actions they've done?
Now, I want to say right off the bat that I did not plant that question. But I did write a book about it called Who Stole the American Dream? You have asked a jackpot question, okay? Louis Brandeis said, I think in 1916, we cannot have high concentration of wealth and a democracy. You can have one or the other, but you can't have both. There are more and more stories talking about how economists are focusing on the fact not only that there is a concentration of wealth inequality, and by the way, the wealth of the median family in America today, not today, excuse me, at the end of 2016, which is the last year for which we have full figures, was 34% below what it was in 2007 before we went into the tumble. That the share of national income going to corporate profits is the highest it's ever been, and the share going to workers' salaries and wages is the lowest in 50 years. During this stock market boom, I just read a story the other day, during the stock market boom, inequality has increased more than in any previous similar period. Stock market boom. So the issue you're talking about is absolutely central. My belief, I started with that question. That's why I wrote that book. I got into that issue and I wrote that book about inequality and what it was doing to this country. And my fear is that we can't deal with it effectively unless we fix the political system. I do believe there's good evidence concrete evidence, not just opinion, that in fact Washington and Congress has been captured by financial interests. It's very interesting. Numbers have come out recently. As a result of the tax cuts enacted at the end of last year, lots of firms got a tax windfall. Sheldon Adelson's Las Vegas Sands company, the casino company he runs, got a $700 million tax windfall from that tax cut. He has contributed $30 million to political campaigns run by the Congressional Leadership Group, which is Paul Ryan's PAC in this election, and there are lots of others like it. So what's going on is that we have high inequality, we have a concentration of wealth and power, and by the way, there are now studies showing that there's a concentration in the profit taking, in the profit earning of a small handful, a small percentage of the companies listed on Wall Street, and that most other companies are not running at a profit. That is, not only are the assets being concentrated in very large banks and very large technical companies, very large oil companies and so forth, but the earnings and the profits are being concentrated. So that the bargaining power of labor or workers is much weaker against concentrated economic power. Labor unions have clearly suffered enormously in terms of strength and membership since the 1950s or 60s, their heyday. There's good evidence that where there are strong labor unions, that the median pay of all workers, not just those in unions, is higher. In right-to-work states where there are weaker unions, the average median pay is lower. So you're right on a very difficult issue, but it's one that is very difficult to solve within the economic system without going to the political system. And within the political system, I think it's very difficult to solve without beginning to restore that connection of people between themselves and their government. That sense that if we get out there and we vote, we get involved in a campaign, we matter, they'll hear us, and it will make a difference after the election. So I think these two sets of issues are very closely intertwined. But I'm glad you raised the question. It's absolutely critical. And the numbers keep piling up, and they suggest they're worse and worse. I mean, when I wrote that book 6 years ago. The book is more on target today than it was when I wrote it. I'm sorry to say.
So one thing that troubles me is the consolidation of such power in just two political parties. And I think it really affected this election when both parties came up with candidates that were a large part unfavorable to a large part of the population, and people chose not to vote or to vote for a smaller party. And in the history of our country, it wasn't always so. We had a time when there were several political parties that could run and put up a viable candidate and get people into offices in the Congress and the House. And it seems to me that this is a really major issue here, because you found the National Democratic Party controlling two viable candidates to the extent of really undermining one of them, which now has come out as in several illegal ways. And then you had the Republican Party just sort of not being able to get their base behind any one person, and emerged with Trump, I think. But so my question is how can we change the system where that we really are going to be more represented than just these two parties, because they also controlled the elections. Okay, they controlled the elections by not having as many polling places, etc. Why does the government not run the elections?
There's no question that we have a political system now that favors parties in a way that our founding fathers would have been distressed at. There's no question that Madison, Washington, Jefferson warned us against the danger of political parties. We now have what are called poor loser laws, which mean that if you run in the party primary for some office, you cannot, and you get beaten, you cannot then run in the general election. And there are good reasons for believing that some of the losers, as I suggested, because of the nonpartisan primary system in Washington, some of the people who lose in the primary could actually win in the general. So that's depriving us of choices. So I think we have some built-in advantages for parties and disadvantages for people out of parties. I would take issue with your representation that we have had periods in American history where we've had multiple parties where people could run. We have not had it. I mean, the closest we ever came was the election of 1912 with the Bull Moose Party, with Teddy Roosevelt running against Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. And we came again with Ross Perot, you know, in the 1990s. But there's never really been a successful third-party movement in American history. The only change we've seen really was the demise of the Whig Party in the 1850s and the rise of the Republican Party. But our history is pretty much a two-party history from the beginning to now. Now, in individual states, that may be different. You may be able to go to Idaho or Washington, particularly western states, and a Green Party candidate can do pretty well. You may be able to go to the southern states where you have a very, very conservative Republican Party wing and have a Libertarian Party do pretty well. But I think there was this movement, I mentioned it before in connection with the Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress. There is this movement by No Labels, which essentially is an effort to try to devise a way to put on the ballot people who are not affiliated with the two major parties. They may have the labels, but they're really running independently. And it's a very noble organization. It's gotten a lot of good things done. There are a lot of things about it that I like, but they have not been successful. I mean, I don't think the history of third-party movements and third-party efforts in America gives much optimism there. This is not to say it couldn't happen in some state, but, and I think we should get rid of some of the laws that we have that, and some of the judicial decisions that we have that favor parties, that give them an iron lock. I think party primaries are terrible. The nonpartisan primary is one of the best ways to go. And it would seem to me that in this country, with a growing number of independent voters, that that should be a movement that would naturally take off, that independent voters would like that. Because once you get in there as an independent voter, the difference between this primary and other primaries is that you can, like a shoelace, you can vote for a Republican for governor, and you can vote for a Democrat for lieutenant governor, or a Democrat for senator, and you can vote, I mean, you can crisscross. And at that point, the hold of the party is being undermined. So to me, that, when looking at the practicalities of the American situation, I would say that's a much more fruitful way to go than to try to get a third party. But this isn't going to stop people from wanting to get a third party. I just would like to see real change, and I think the odds of that happening are really low. Oh, back there.
Please speak to the possible elimination of the Electoral College.
That is a critical issue, and it is changing even as we meet. There are two ways to go. One way is to try to amend the Constitution. Amending the Constitution is tough, and you've got to go through a whole lot of states that would basically lose some extra electoral votes that they have. They're highly unlikely to do that. The other way to go is the way that people are doing it right now. I've forgotten the name of the movement, but fundamentally what goes on is that the legislature in the state commits the state by law to cast that state's electoral votes for the winner of the national popular vote. Okay? So the way you get around the Electoral College, you say, you know, here we are in Michigan. I don't care, even if the Democrat wins, if the Republican wins the national popular vote, all our electoral votes go to that Republican nominee. Okay? Now, what you have at the moment is something like, and my numbers are not going to be right, but you can probably find it on my website, about states that have about 130 electoral votes have adopted that. All right? So you need, to get to 270, you need more states with 140 electoral votes. When you get to the point that you have states that have 270 or 271 electoral votes committed to voting for the winner of the national popular vote, you will effectively have eliminated the Electoral College. And at the moment, we're about halfway there. And what's interesting is it has to be passed by both houses of the state legislature. There are about 12 states where one house or the other of the state legislature has passed this. It hasn't passed in the other house during that session. You have to go back in the next session and start all over again. But people are working on this. This is another reform movement that I didn't get into today, but it is another place where people are at work trying to fix the system and get us out of the 18th century and the 21st century. Somebody back over here.
Yeah. Is it on? Yeah. I just wanted to follow up on that. The National Popular Vote Compact is the name of the organization, and it actually has 165 electoral votes now. And it's, I think, 11 states, including D.C. So it's something that our local Our Revolution tried to work on last year to get people in states where they haven't passed it yet to pass it so that we can move past the Electoral College. So if you know people in states that haven't passed it, and I couldn't rattle them off here right now, but if you Google National Popular Vote Compact, you can actually make this happen.
Yeah.
And Washington State is one of the ones that has passed it, as has California, New York, and some of the other low-hanging fruit.
This is another very important reform. My point here is this strengthens the idea that I was suggesting to. This is not a time to feel powerless. This is actually a time to get engaged. People are engaged working on these issues. Change is happening. And these things all take time. I mean, I gave you the example of Florida trying 5 times to pass gerrymander reform until they finally did it. You have to hang in there. I mean, there are people who will say, Rick, or Mr. Smith, whatever it is, you know, you talk about this, and we tried it, and it didn't work. And I say, how many times did you try it, and when, and where? And, you know, and the answer is you got to hang in there. And people look back, just give me a moment. I covered the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and people all remember Martin Luther King giving that famous I Have a Dream speech. What they forget is it took him 9 years to get from the Montgomery bus boycott to Washington, D.C. and the Lincoln Memorial. Okay, so you got to remember, it takes time, but it does happen. Okay, great.
Money is the mother's milk of politics. And this morning I was looking at my phone, and it showed me how money is bouncing around the United States of America to help people win elections from different states that they don't even live in. How is that possible? How is it possible that an organization like the NRA gets $30 million to invest in an election? Where did it come from? Where does this money come from? How come there's no records of where this money comes from? And why should people like the Koch brothers have an effect on an election in Washington? Thank you.
Great question. Where do you live? This state?
I live right here.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, that's a very important question, and you hit a really neuralgic issue. People are really upset with out-of-state money affecting in-state elections, and they want to try to do something about it. Now, it just happens that I have a segment in my documentary, one that I didn't talk to you about earlier, that actually is addressing this question and specifically addressing the Koch network. And it addresses the way the state of California has dealt with this. It has dealt with this in a way that is more effective than almost any other state. Part of the problem with regulating political money is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has basically said at this point money is speech. It can't be regulated. Okay? So the next best thing most people think of is disclosure. Okay? So what happens is people set up organizations like Americans for Responsible Leadership, Americans for Job Security, the Center to Protect Patient Rights. And they put money into those places, and those places put the money into campaigns. And if you're sitting in Washington and you happen to be concerned about health care and somebody's put some money in, I don't know, genetically modified crops, and it says the Center to Protect Patients' Rights, well, that sounds pretty good. You're not very suspicious. but you have no idea who put that money up, okay? It does happen to be Koch money. That happens to be a Koch front, okay? Now, what's really interesting about the state of California is that they have passed a law, they have passed a bunch of laws which say that any group spending $50,000 in a California election must disclose its funders back to the basic individual funders. So it starts to go, you know. Now, in the case that we followed, and it's really fascinating, it's a great detective story. It starts out with a group called the Small Business Action Committee in California pumping $15 million of ads at the very end of a political campaign, 3 weeks before the end of the campaign, to defeat a ballot initiative to raise $50 million to fund public education, which happened to be the governor's particular pet, and another $10 million to beat to promote a ballot initiative which deprived labor unions of an ability to spend money in political campaigns. But they were very cleverly disguised, okay? So the Common Cause saw this in the reporting. California requires that it's reported. And so the $15 million goes blip, shows up on the website. Common Cause says, where'd that come from? They start working on it, but they report it to a thing in California called the Fair Political Practices Commission. Now, typically the Fair Political Practices Commission, whatever it's called in any state, says, oh, yawn, 3 weeks before the election, no chance in the world we can get that information. We'll investigate it thoroughly after the election. But in this case, a woman named Ann Ravel, who was running the CPPC, said, we're going to find out who that is. She turned it over to a guy named Gary Winnick, who was her chief investigative officer. And it turned out the money had come from what I just said, a group in Arizona called Americans for Responsible Leadership, ho-hum, right? Well, the interesting thing about Americans for Responsible Leadership is until it spent that $15 million, it had never spent more than $50,000 in any political campaign. Bingo, somebody's playing a game, right? So they go to work on that group and they say, you got to report and you have to tell us who it is under California law now. And they resist, and they resist, and they finally get a call from a very big-name law firm in Washington, D.C. Suspicions rise even further. What? And this happens, this guy, the law firm happens to have offices in the same building as Karl Rove and a bunch of other guys, and they happen to represent the Republican National Committee in a bunch of campaign finance disputes. So they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So they finally, the California Fair Political Practices Division decides they got to go to court. And literally about 10 days before the election, they file suit. A local judge says to this Americans for Responsible Leadership, you got to disclose your donors. That's what the law says. You got to do it right away. And so they start to go into a stall. And Ann Ravel says, we're going to the state Supreme Court. They go to the state Supreme Court on the Friday before Election Tuesday. Okay? The state Supreme Court meets by telephone on the weekend before, and it orders this group to disclose its funders. It looks like they're not going to do it, but the Monday before the election, it comes out, they admit it. They submit 3 letters. The Small Business Action Committee says it got its money from Americans for Responsible Leadership. Americans for Responsible Leadership says it got its money from a Virginia group, Americans for Job Security. Okay? And it passed its money to the Center to Protect Patients' Rights. All of these are part of the Koch national network. Okay, we knew that by that time. In fact, this case was the first real disclosure of how the Koch network worked. Okay, so we go into election, and Jerry Brown is beating the drums, and he's saying this is outside state money, and this is dirty money, and we're being perverted and corrupted, and all that kind of stuff. And both the ballot initiatives that the big money wanted got beaten, but we still didn't know who the funders were. So Gary Winnick goes on a 1-year-long investigation, and he tracks it back down to this Virginia group, Americans for Job Security. He finally finds that there are a couple of Republican operatives in the state of California who've been raising money from them from very wealthy Californians. Surprise, surprise. Californians are sending the money out to Virginia, back to New Jersey, back to Arizona, to get it back to California. Why? Well, some of them were good friends of Jerry Brown, and they really didn't want Jerry Brown to know that they were fighting, right? And then some of them had companies, and I'm going to tell you who they were in a minute. Some of them had companies that had unions, and they didn't want the unions to know that they were funding a thing that was against unions, right? So they were passing the money way around. So it turned out, in the end, it wasn't Koch money that was being used. It was Koch channels that were being used by these people, okay? So what happens in the end is that Winnick forces an audit of Americans for Job Security. Now, at that point, there was a loophole in California law, which is called the first bite of the apple. If it's the first time you spent money in a California campaign, you don't have to disclose. So they went and closed that loophole immediately after this. So what they said was, we will give you our list, but we're going to black out the names of all the donors, okay? Okay, so they're redacted. The story gets better. The story gets better, okay? So a smart reporter for the Los Angeles Times holds the redacted up to the light, and through the light he can read who the donors are. And so the Los Angeles Times runs a front page story that the biggest donors are Charlie Schwab. You know, trust Charlie, right? You need to know Charlie is a hardball political player, right? Eli Broad, a supposed grand patron of education who has been funding an anti-education ballot initiative, and Max Fisher, head of the Gap, CEO of the Gap. And there are others, but those three will do. So and then what happened is, after that, they went to the legislature and they closed the first bite of the apple loophole. The answer is that we have to get away from something that is a big problem in federal law. In federal law, political action committees have to disclose their funders. Social welfare nonprofits do not. Okay? And so what's going on is, most of the money that's now going into politics through super PACs is going to social welfare. Now, social welfare nonprofits used to be your local hospital, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America. I mean, genuine social welfare organizations. But most of the Tea Party patriots and, you know, Common Cause and Planned Parenthood, I mean, let's be honest, it's on both sides. They're now social welfare, and if they don't spend more than 50% of their expenditures on politics, they don't have to disclose. And nobody knows how to get at that. Nobody's investigating that. So California has gone a step further, and they've said, we don't give a damn whether or not you're social welfare or you're political. If you spend $50,000 in a California campaign, you have to disclose. So what we need is laws like that in every state. Now, that doesn't keep the out-of-state money from coming in, but what it does do is it lets you know it. And if you've got smart in-state politicians like Jerry Brown, you make that a major issue. And it's very unpopular all over the country. I mean, I go from here to New Hampshire, and there's no state I've been where out-of-state money isn't unpopular. So if you have that kind of disclosure, and it's timely, it has to be timely before the vote. If you have to have aggressive enforcement, such as they had in California, and it comes out before the vote, it's devastating. And California has not had so much of that problem ever since that case. They've still got problems with hidden money, but at least that loophole, at least that part of it, has been closed off. So the answer is, you know, hang in there and be tough. I mean, you need to find people who are prepared to work for this. And you've got people who are willing to run for office, who are willing to work for this, and smart attorneys, smart legislators. I guarantee you, though, if you go back and fix gerrymandering, and you do public funding of campaigns, you're going to find a very different environment in the legislature to dealing with precisely this issue. I mean, I spent a lot of time trying to trace these things back and figure out where the hell you grab the damn cat, you know, and where you get a hold of the sheep and begin to try to corral them. And I really believe that political reform is essential to do this. In California, you happen to have a governor who is disposed to do this. You happen to have a legislature who is disposed to do this. You can do it in Massachusetts. Let me tell you, I'm following a bunch of people in South Dakota, and they are gutsy. These are reformers in South Dakota that are trying, but they are up against Goliath. I mean, you have no idea. This is a state that is 46% by registration Republican, and the legislature is 80% Republican. I mean, that's how bad the gerrymandering is. So I mean, it's really tough to go fight that kind of thing. So when you think about the state you're in, the opportunity here to continue reform is just, it's terrific.
I want to thank you for outlining some things that are going right in this country and that can give all of us much needed hope. These are all reforms, and I quote you when I say reforms take time. So my question is, how much time do you think this democracy has left?
Well, that's a very important question.
And let me mention one thing I mean by that. If the Republicans maintain control of both houses of Congress in Washington after 2018, which hopefully they won't, I am afraid that Trump will be even less controllable, and the last checks and balances might disappear. So my question to you is, how much time do you think we have left?
Well, I think the question you raise, the way you've cast it is cast in a very personal and partisan way, but I think that in terms of Trump and the Republicans, but I think the issues are much more fundamental, and they deserve being addressed. We come up to the next census in 2020, which means we come up to the next national gerrymandering in 2021-22. I think that if there is not significant gerrymander reform to create more states with more competitive political districts, the danger of a self-perpetuating party monopoly in this country may not be the end of American democracy, but for an awful lot of people in an awful lot of states, it will be. It already is. South Dakota, I just mentioned to you, is one of them where people are fighting. I think that's really very fundamental. I mean, I'm concerned about the election of 2018. I don't know what the outcome will be, but I've got some feelings about it. But I really think more fundamental is whether or not we can regain the structures that give us a chance to fight back. That's really important. Do we have voting laws that really let everybody at least have the opportunity to vote, even if they don't take it? Do we have district lines drawn so that there is a genuine competition and people have a choice, so that when you talk about issues, as we are today, that the debate that you have about substance actually counts? I mean, that's absolutely critical. I do not see a way around the big money in politics. Somebody mentioned earlier money being the mother's milk of politics. I don't see any way to limit that short of a constitutional amendment. And even within 19 states, that's only halfway. You got to get to 38, and that's really tough, going from here to there. But the public funding is a way that you can go. It's a way in which people can sense a reconnection with their state legislature and their state government. And the times when America has recovered, I mean, the great progressive movement of the early 19th century, you know, I mean, the 20th century, you know, Teddy Roosevelt, the progressives, that whole era came from the bottom up. And it seems to me that's where the strength, that's where the opportunity is. So while I'm focused on 2018, I'm not only focused on that. I think what happens between now and 2022 is really important. And not, you know, we're so focused on who wins the White House. And it's important. I don't want to diminish that. But the Democrats today, and our choice in America today, is limited, and we're in trouble because the Democrats were so focused on winning the White House in 2008, 2012, they didn't worry about state governments, and in lots of states there's no choice. So, I mean, we need to recalibrate our thinking. And the media is not helping us, because the media is always focused. You know, it's really easy to follow one character. And I used to be a reporter, you know, way back in the old day. You know, it's really easy to chase a fire truck, right? We've got a fire truck in the White House, literally. I mean, there's a blaze going on every day, and so you report on today's blaze. And do you actually add to people's understanding of policy and events by doing that? No. So it takes a much more sophisticated, variegated approach, it seems to me. So I haven't given up yet, but we're in perilous shape.
Hendrik, my name is Walt Corbin. I live here on Orcas. You hit the nail on the head. You know, the word is more powerful than the sword. The only problem is last year 28% of the people in the United States did not read. And I'm very fearful that this president is bullying the is bullying the press.
It's not closeness, it's pointing it. There you go.
Okay. Is bullying the press. And like you said, they're following the fire engine. They're not talking about the real issues that are important to the American people, like health care, inequality, repair of our major infrastructure. You write about the written word that you write about is wonderful, and you write to the choir. We support the words and the wisdom that come from your writing. But what is most important is the general public that is listening to the media, TV and radio, that simply bully the press and don't go after the true story of our democracy. And I think somehow, some way, that you, the written side of the media, has to embarrass the word side or the TV, radio side to do something as constructive as you are doing with a written word.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me say, Walt, I'm whacking away at it. Let me just address one thing that kind of slid by in the midst of your comments that's really important. And that is the notion that not much has changed since 2016. That and I don't want to just deal with this as a Trump base and as a Republican issue. John McCain was a Republican. Bob Mueller is a Republican. I voted for lots of Republicans. Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican. There were a lot of Republicans that we've had them. What's happening is it's slipping away. But I was preparing for this talk. I was going through some projections on what might happen in Senate races. And I came across a conservative outlet, and it was saying to conservatives and Republicans, don't worry about the Senate, we're in pretty good shape. Trump's approval rating in 13 states, which have competitive or quite competitive Senate races, is really strong everywhere except in Nevada. Only in Nevada is it negative. And I thought to myself, gee, I wonder what Trump's approval rating or his vote percentage was in those same 13 states in 2016. And in every single state but Texas, there was a significant decline. In other words, the supposedly encouraging statistics that were being offered were actually less encouraging than before. My point is that it seems as though nothing is changing and nobody's viewpoint is changing. But in fact, it is happening. And the difficulty is that watching that kind of change is like watching grass grow. You can't see it grow. You only see the lawn after it's up there. And we're only going to know whether or not it's there after on November 7th, you know, and then beyond that. But I think there's pretty good evidence. The women's marches, Student March for Our Lives, the teacher strikes in Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kentucky, West Virginia. Teachers in those states are not only saying we're not being paid well enough, they're saying we as a state are not investing enough in education. They're raising a citizens' protest. Now, admittedly, they're an organized body with a self-interest, but teachers have not been doing that. So when I'm as a reporter, I mean, I spent years in Moscow, and I had a hell of a lot less information in Moscow, trying to figure out what was going on in the Soviet Union than I do in America. But I go around and look and try to collect information that's telling me what's going on that hasn't been organized, codified, and then emblazoned in some headline or some event. And I think there's lots of evidence that this country is in a rebellious mood and in a mood for change. Now, part of that I base on the fact that I think the election of 2016 was an election of rebellion. I don't think it was a right-left election. I don't think it was a Republican, a Democratic election. In the general election, it came down to it. But it was perceived as an election of the bottom up. You got to remember, Bernie came from nowhere. This is a guy 73 years old, a self-declared Democratic Socialist from a state with 3 electoral votes. He did not come from Texas or Pennsylvania, or California, one of the mighty states. He came out of nowhere and he nearly knocked off an absolutely assumed anointed leader. That tells you, and he lit a fire under a generation that we all believe is totally uninterested in politics. Not true. So all I'm saying is that some of the things we say to ourselves and to each other, living in a fairly narrow social political milieu, and I don't mean just on this island, I have the same kind of conversations in D.C., because I mix with a whole lot of people who got a college education and who are reasonably well off, and so on and so forth. We're not out there with a whole lot of other people. Stuff is happening in this country, and I think you're absolutely right. I would love to embarrass the media. Let me tell you, I wasn't out to embarrass the media. I was out to get my friggin' documentary on the air. And I spent months arguing with PBS. And they couldn't make up their mind, and that's why I went to MSNBC in the end. Okay? So it's not just a matter of embarrassing. I was saying, hey, I'm opening you up. I'm giving you a story nobody else is covering for you. Wouldn't you like it? Too much cynicism. Can't be done. Uninteresting. Okay? The problem isn't just that they're mesmerized by the fire engine. They are. That's easy journalism. They're cynical. They're more cynical in many ways than the public is. And they're a lot younger. We're talking about journalists between 30 and 50 years old. That's a serious tragedy. Anyway, you guys have been great. I want to thank you. I don't want to cut it off. If somebody else has got an urgent question, I'll take it. Yes, particularly if it comes from a lady.
I just want you to speak to the cyber stuff, that election hacking.
The hacking?
The hacking of our election.
I don't know what I can add to what you already know. I mean, it's clear, we have a clear assessment of our intelligence agencies that they hacked the 2016 election, not just got into the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's emails. What's really important is that in 20 states, they got into election registration electronics. Okay? Everybody's extremely careful to say that they cannot say that ballots were switched, that votes were switched. But there are definitely dozens, if not scores, of cases in Georgia and North Carolina and a couple of other states I can't remember the names of at the moment. Maybe Indiana, Kansas, I'm not sure. But Georgia and North Carolina, I know. There were people who were turned away from the polls who were properly registered, and this was not a matter of the photo ID law, but somehow their registration records had been fooled with. So there have been warnings from the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, former Indiana Republican senator, to the states that they need to do corrective measures now. And you have a bunch of states that have gone to combining electronic and paper ballots, so there's a paper trail to make sure that there can't be interference. But I think we're in a very risky period here. I think we don't know whether or not the Russians will try to fool with the actual vote count, and whether or not they can do so. What appears to be the case, and I have to say my information is really incomplete, but what appears to be the case is when you have wealthy cities like Los Angeles or New York, and they have fairly sophisticated cyber units cybersecurity units that can protect the sanctity of their ballot, that they're taking quite a lot of measures and they're actually spending some money. But if you go into other states, particularly rural states, where there simply just isn't the money, even if there's the will, you simply are not seeing anywhere near that kind of care being taken. And the wherewithal is not there. And this is one of the reasons why you have a number of the intelligence chiefs who have been screaming since last January, February, to the White House and to Trump that you have to allocate more federal funds to help these states protect themselves and the sanctity of the ballot in the states. And I've raised the question a couple of times in blogs that I've written on my website as to whether or not the failure of the president to protect the 2018 election is a violation of his constitutional oath to defend the Constitution of the United States on January 20th, 2017. I mean, it seems to me that, I'm not trying to make a partisan argument there. I'm simply saying, isn't it the duty of the president, if there is a perceived threat from a foreign power to our ability to conduct an election, to put that, somewhere more up on number 1, 2, or 3 in his priorities and to be raising hell about it, not only with Mr. Putin, but with the Congress and with the states and so forth. I mean, I think that's a very fundamental thing. So I'm glad you raised that question. Let me thank you. You're a great audience. We love being with you. To learn more about the victories of citizen reform movements, come to our website, reclaimtheamericandream.org, and click on Success Stories. And check out our YouTube channel, The People versus the Politicians.